This is a 1996 Mitsubishi Pajero Mini, and it's an incredibly tiny but incredibly cute SUV that was sold in Japan for years. You know the Mitsubishi Montero, which was sold in the United States. There was also the Montero Sport, which was sold in the United States. Well, this is sort of the Montero Sport. It's 4.5 feet shorter than a Mercedes C-Class, and today I'm going to review it. Before I get started, big news, this Mitsubishi Pajero Mini is currently listed for sale live on Cars and Bids, where it is being auctioned with no reserve. This is a little four-wheel drive. It has four-wheel drive, and it has a US title. It's been legally imported to the United States, and now you can buy it if you want to do some tiny off-roading. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description to head over to the live auction for this Pajero Mini, only on Cars and Bids. And more big news, Cars and Bids is approaching its 1-year anniversary, our first birthday. And to celebrate, we are giving free listings for the entire month of June. If you want to list your car on Cars and Bids, just use the discount code BIRTHDAY when you submit it, and you can get a free listing. It's valid the entire month of June on Cars and Bids, the best place to sell your modern car from the 1980s and up, now officially 1 year old. Woohoo! Okay, but back to the Pajero Mini. Now, earlier I mentioned this was sort of like a smaller version of the Mitsubishi Montero, and really that's exactly what it is. In Japan, the Montero was sold as the Mitsubishi Pajero. And for people who didn't want the big, expensive, massive Pajero, but they still wanted some off-road capabilities, Mitsubishi made this, sort of a scaled-down, city-friendly off-roader version of the Pajero called the Pajero Mini. The Pajero Mini was sold from 1994 all the way into 2012, and it's a K car, which means that it fits into this incredibly tiny Japanese car classification that gives it a discount for taxes and insurance purposes. Just how tiny? Well, like I said earlier, this is about 5 feet shorter than a Mercedes C-Class. This is only 130 inches long. It's 3 feet shorter than a Mini Cooper, just incredibly tiny. And it's got an incredibly tiny engine too, a 650cc four-cylinder, 0.65 liters, that makes only about 65 horsepower. And today I'm going to review it, or at least I'm going to try. We will see if I fit. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Pajero Mini and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Pajero Mini with getting inside. That means starting with the key fob, which is kind of unusual. You can see it here. The seller of this car sells a lot of Japanese market cars on Cars and Bids, and he said he's never seen one of these with a lock-unlock key fob like this has. These were very basic cars in Japan in the 90s. They didn't usually have that amenity, but you can see here it works. You press lock, the doors lock. You press unlock, the doors unlock. That is a pretty nice touch, but it does not compare to the quirkiness of the other key fob on this key ring, and that would be a remote starter. Now, the seller cannot figure out how to get this remote starter to work. He says he has the owner's manual, but it's all in Japanese. He doesn't know what to do to make it work. But there's no question that one step in the process of making it work involves unfurling this antenna from the key fob in order to point it at the car. This must have seemed like the coolest feature in Japan back in the 90s. You'd walk up to your Pajero Mini and say, "Watch this," and then you'd pull out your antenna from your key fob, you'd press the button and the car would start right up, and all of your friends thought you had the coolest new feature, and that is ridiculous. A retractable and extendable antenna on a key fob for the remote starter. What a wonderful 90s Japanese car quirk. And next up we go to get in the Pajero Mini, and one of the first things you notice when you open the door is just how small the door panel is, how thin it is. There's only like an inch or two of door panel in here, and this is very light and feels rather flimsy. Very much a contrast to modern cars that have all sorts of like amenities on the door panels, storage pockets, that sort of thing. You don't have that here. Now the reason for that is, like I said earlier, this is a K car, which is this Japanese regulatory size classification that is very tiny, and if cars can fit into this classification, then they get certain breaks on taxes and insurance. The goal is to incentivize people to buy tiny cars that don't really take up all that much space in crowded Japanese cities, which makes sense, but the problem is when you have a tiny little car, interior space can also be tiny, so the automakers do whatever they can to maximize interior space, and that means tiny little door panels so they can have larger seats and more room inside, which makes sense. In fact, over on the driver door, of course the other side of the car, you can see the window switches look like they barely fit on this door panel. Almost looks like a mistake, like they're kind of hanging off, they barely fit. And over on the passenger side, it's an even smaller door panel. You can see designed around just having one window switch, again, to make these door panels as small as possible to try to provide as much interior room as possible. Kind of an interesting thing. And next up, we move inside the Pajero Mini, and you can see it is quite mini in here, rather small interior, although I, as someone who's 6'3", 6'4", I fit just fine in the front seat, although we'll get to the back seats. Yes, there are back seats. We'll get to those in a minute. A little different story back there, but the interior is relatively roomy up here. You have two relatively roomy seats. Again, they did whatever they could to maximize passenger space, and it certainly shows. Now, one quirk that I love, when you first open the door, you see this very 1990s seat fabric on the seats here. It's sort of like a vague design, not really anything particular, but it's meant to keep you a little happier in this car rather than just looking at boring gray seats like you would have had in the 70s and 80s. One thing I love about this seat fabric pattern is that they didn't do it in the back seats. They decided they were going to cut that cost and only give you a little fun pattern on your front seats. That was all you deserved if you were getting a Pajero Mini. And in fact, this car is all about the basics. Everything in here is kind of made with the theme of only what you need and really nothing else. So you can see the layout of this interior, very basic, very simple, everything exactly where you'd expect, and no like extra buttons, switches, no extra frills really at all. Again, you only basically have what you need. With that said, there are some nice features in here. For instance, you do have air conditioning. You can see this little switch here with the snowflake on it. You twist that and it turns on the AC, although with this tiny engine, I have to assume the AC robs a lot of power while you're driving around, but you have it. You also had four-wheel drive in here. You can see the lever is right here between the seats. You have 4 low and 4 high, and of course 2 high. This is a tiny little SUV, but it was a relatively capable one with 4-wheel drive. You even have a grab handle over on the passenger side of the dashboard, so the passengers can hold on for dear life when you're doing major 4-wheel drive maneuvers. Of course, truthfully, you probably wouldn't be doing that crazy off-roading in this, but given this thing's small size, it's lightweight, and its short overhangs from the wheels, it's probably a relatively capable off-roader off the pavement. I think it would be kind of fun to toss around and see what it could do. Your real limitation would be tires. They are very small and very thin, but you got 4-wheel drive and you have your grab handle, so you can get going. But anyway, on to the interesting quirks in this interior, and there are a few. One is on the gear selector. You can see this has an automatic, and all of the gears kind of point to neutral. You can see reverse points down, drive points up, neutral is right in the center, and green. I'm not sure why neutral is the gear that they're all excited to be pointing to instead of like drive, but they are, which is kind of strange. Now, speaking of the quirks of this gear selector, when you put it in reverse, the car beeps. Take a listen. Now you can hear it's not beeping on the outside like a commercial truck backing up, like beep, beep. Instead it's beeping in here so that you know it's in reverse, which you'd think you would because you just put it in reverse, but it does that just to make absolutely certain that you know. Next up, another interesting quirk in here, the gauges, the tachometer, you can see goes up to 10,000 RPM, which seems a little ambitious for this vehicle. Redline is at 8,000 RPM, which is pretty impressive for a little automatic SUV from the 90s, but like I mentioned earlier, this has a 650cc 4-cylinder engine, very tiny little 4-cylinder, so you probably were actually using all of those RPMs when you were trying to accelerate hard, get to the top of the rev range so that you could go anywhere. So maybe that isn't as crazy as you think, but you don't really expect to see an 8,000 RPM on a vehicle like this, but it has one. And next up, another interesting quirk in this interior. To the right of the steering wheel, you have this little switch here that turns on the fog lights. You can turn them on at any time. They operate independently of the headlights, and they are hilarious. Take a look at them up front. They look so aggressive and mean and like off-road capable, even though this is this tiny tiny little off-roader, but they're behind these like Mitsubishi grates so that nothing damages them when you're off-roading in the jungle. And you have these little fog lights here that will help guide you when you're off-road. Probably a little bit overkill for this vehicle, but it did help sell the appearance as sort of like a mini version of the muscular Pajero off-roader. Next up, another wonderful quirk of this interior is the owner's manual, of course found in the glove box. It's all in Japanese, but I do love the cover, this little drawing of a Pajero Mini. Pretty faithful little drawing, kind of a cool little look to put on the front of the owner's manual. It's neat to see that there. Next up, another interesting quirk in this interior. In the center console, you probably didn't notice it before, it's sort of hidden below the stereo. You have this little panel pulls out for cup holders. Cup holders were not common in Japanese cars from this era, but this one has them. Probably pretty flimsy, can't really hold very large cups, but there are cup holders nonetheless, which is a nice amenity to have, and kind of surprising for a car like this. Next up, one other interesting quirk in here is over on the door panel where you have two warning labels. Now the warning label closest to the driver, I used my Google Translate to figure out that it tells you how to use the transfer case in four-wheel drive, and that makes sense. The other warning label tells you to avoid automatic car washes because this has a roof spoiler. And indeed it does. In the back, there is a roof spoiler back there, and they're saying if you go through an automatic car wash, the roof spoiler might damage the spoiler, so you don't want to do that. Kind of an interesting thing to give you that warning. This all-important roof spoiler might be damaged, so don't go through an automatic car wash. You wouldn't want to harm your Pajero Mini roof spoiler. And next up, we move on to the Pajero Mini's back seats. Yes, like I mentioned earlier, there are back seats, even though this is only 130 inches long. And accessing the back seat is actually pretty easy. There are a couple of little levers you pull on the side of the front seat to kind of move the front seat forward, and then you have actually a pretty good amount of space that you can use to climb into the back seats. It's really not all that difficult, although once you're back here, you can see there is basically no space. You can see I can barely get the front seat to come back to where it would need to go to fit back in place and get a passenger in here. And the back seat in this car is completely no frills. It's really tiny. There's nothing interesting or exciting back here. It is tremendously small with basically no room. You'd only use it in an emergency or for the smallest children if you want. Otherwise, it's just sort of a back seat just to have one. And next up, another drawback to the back seats can be seen in the cargo area where there's just not all that much space. In order to put back seats in a vehicle this tiny and still make them relatively usable, you got to put them basically all the way back, which steals practically all of your cargo room. So you only have like a foot of cargo space behind the back seats. Although it is worth noting, this cargo floor can actually lift up and you can put a few more little items in here if you don't want them rolling around to the back or if you don't want them visible. Now, with that said, with these back seats, it is tremendously easy to fold them down if you want. You just pull up on this little switch and then push the back seat forward and it's down. Do the same thing on the other side and then you have massively more cargo room, but of course coming at the expense of your back seats. So you have to decide if you want the back seats or the cargo space, but such is life in a vehicle this tiny. And next up, another interesting item back here is the tailgate itself, which you can see is hinged on the side like a door rather than hinged at the top like most traditional tailgates. This one opens to the side. So if you want to go close it, you close it like a door from the side, and obviously same deal if you want to open it up, it opens up like a door. Now the reason that they do this, I suspect, is that the spare tire is mounted on the tailgate, and spare tires can make it pretty heavy. If you have like a lift up tailgate, you might not be able to lift it up with that heavy tire and wheel on there, and plus it can cause additional stress to the struts, which will cause the tailgate to fall down, so they make it a door. It's easier to open. Although this particular spare tire probably wouldn't make it very heavy, even if it was a normal tailgate. This is a 175 15-inch tire, incredibly narrow, incredibly small, not a big tire at all. Tiny tire for a tiny vehicle, but that's all it really needs. And next up, since I'm out here, some other interesting Pajero Mini quirks on the outside. One thing, I love this little badge on the B-pillar that says Pajero Mini all-round four-wheel drive. Not all around four-wheel drive, which of course would be the correct way to put it, all-round four-wheel drive. That particular translation didn't quite make it perfectly into English. By the way, you can see on the side here, the mirror looks like it's not there. Just the shiny part that is the mirror fell off while I was filming this video. You can glue it right back on. I just don't have any glue, and I will do that as soon as I give this car back to its owner. But speaking of mirrors, over on the passenger side, on the front fender, you can see this tiny little mirror mounted here. This was a common thing that a lot of Japanese cars had in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The thinking was it made it easier to park, it made tight lane changes easier, maneuvering in small spaces, and it was an extra mirror for your blind spot too. You could see into your blind spot. It's actually a pretty good idea. You drive around and it's unusually helpful, but it's ugly having a mirror sitting there on the front fender. So generally Japanese cars have given this up, even though it is a relatively helpful safety feature. It just doesn't look good, as you can see here. And next up on the outside, another fantastic quirk. I've been telling you that this car is very basic. It gives you only what you need, and that is certainly true. You're probably also aware that some Japanese cars from this era, you would turn on the radio and then the antenna would automatically extend out for better radio reception. Well, in this car, you have to manually extend the antenna yourself for better reception. Again, the basics, only what you need. They didn't want to give you an antenna motor because that would just make the car excessively heavy and complicated. The good news is the antenna very easily placed. You're cruising along, you turn on the radio, you want better reception, you just kind of reach up here and oh, there it is. And you can extend the antenna while you're cruising along in your Pajero Mini. You can't do that in your car, which frankly is probably a good thing. Kind of a stupid feature, but that's what the Pajero Mini has. Again, only the basics in this car. And next up, since we're out here, we gotta talk styling and design. To be honest, I really like how this thing looks, and I always have. You know, the Japanese K cars can be kind of strange looking. Usually it's very weird, tall hatchbacks that are absolutely bizarre. You can see some examples here, but Mitsubishi took the K car dimensions and made a nice looking, kind of tough looking SUV. They actually did a pretty good job with it. In fact, it kind of reminds me of the new Suzuki Jimny, which is also sold in Japan as a K car, which has been like a global icon in the last few years because of how cool it is. This like tiny little boxy vehicle. This is a lot like that, frankly. Also kudos to Mitsubishi for really making this look like a smaller version of the Pajero, or the Montero as we know it, fitting in with the K car dimensions, but still creating like a little Pajero that gave you sort of that tough feel, even though it isn't actually the real thing. That's kind of neat. But of all the styling with this car, I think the piece I like the best is the front end, which is just this fantastic mix of both tough and rugged, and also cute and little, and it just works so perfectly. With the tough and rugged, you have this brush bar in front, and of course the fog lights that make it look like a muscular off-road SUV, but then it's also cute with these little circle headlights, and it's so tiny, and it's just a fantastic combination of the two, just like you'd expect from this little tiny Japanese K car that also happens to be the little brother of a big muscular SUV. I think it's a really good look. And next up, since I'm up front, let's talk engine, where a lot of the tough and rugged kind of goes away in favor of the cute and little. Now, like I mentioned, this has a tremendously small engine, about 650 cc's, 0.65 liters. It's really tiny, and it made about 65 to 75 horsepower, depending on which version you got. But either way, it ain't a lot of power. This is a small engine, small horsepower, but worth noting, it's also a small vehicle. Like I said, 130 inches long, and this only weighs about 1,900 pounds. It's lighter in weight than a Lotus Elise. So you didn't really need that much power, although 65-ish horsepower, probably not really an ideal figure. You could use a little more, but that's what it had to have to conform to the K car regulations, and so that's what it has. Small engine for a small vehicle. And so those are the quirks and features of the Mitsubishi Pajero Mini. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Mitsubishi Pajero Mini, and it is very mini, although as you can see, I do fit in here, and there's really good headroom actually. I have several more inches of headroom, not so bad in here. Of course, the back seat, as you saw, is a little bit of a different experience. The first thing, I am blown away by how similar this is to the new Suzuki Jimny, which I just filmed. That video is going to go up in a few weeks. Everything about this is very, very similar. The packaging, the styling, a lot of similarities between the two, and it almost seems like to make the Jimny, Suzuki kind of looked at this and said, okay, this was a real success in the 90s, let's kind of revive this concept. And obviously Suzuki has made a lot of small off-roaders for a long time, but back in this era, the Suzukis were a lot crashier and rougher. This was easier to live with, just like the Jimny is now. Now, I should say the seller of this car on Cars and Bids is, he goes by the username Cars From Afar, and he specializes in these JDM cars. He does a really good job of finding like cool, low mileage JDM stuff, and so I'm thrilled to be be able to be here in Tennessee with him to review this very unusual little vehicle. And he mentioned he gets a lot of his cars through Japan Cars Direct, sort of like the person he uses in Japan to help him find cars and buy cars. So that is worth noting. But nice to check this thing out from Cars From Afar. He's become kind of a famous seller on Cars and Bids. So what is this thing like? Well, the truth is, it's actually not as bad as I thought. I thought it would be lethargic and slow, and it is pretty slow, to be honest. But it gets around. I mean, I'm driving around town here, and it's totally fine. It gets up to power speed relatively quickly. It makes a lot of noise to accelerate. I mean, this car is not about luxury or sound deadening or any of that stuff. So when you get on it, you hear a lot. It doesn't go that fast, but you hear a lot. But I don't know, it's a fun little, the thing I like about these cars, these little SUVs, especially from the 90s, is they're just so eager. Wranglers were like this thing is like this. You just kind of point it where you want, it goes there, it can go over stuff if you want it to. It's like a pretty usable vehicle, actually, and I think that that's kind of a neat thing about it. In terms of the driving experience, it is really kind of impressive how just easy it is, and that really is the thing I like the most about these old 90s SUVs, just the eagerness. You just kind of point it and it goes, you can see everywhere. It's just such an honest car. There's no like tons of tech or things you have to figure out, or like you have to learn how to drive it before you can use it. You just kind of get in, point and shoot, and it goes. And I frankly like how these look. I like the boxy styling. I think they look cool. And they're neat cars. I think the only real drawback for a lot of Americans is the right-hand drive, which I do admit does get a little annoying. I've had a few right-hand drive cars before, and it gets you got to get used to it, which, you know, some people don't want to do that. And obviously the turn signals, the wipers are switched, so you got to put on the turn signal and the windshield wipers are gone. That's something also you have to get used to. And I think these little SUVs would be popular in the States if they were sold new. I think that's true of the Jimny at kind of a low price for a no-frills SUV buyer. And I think this is kind of a cool look back at like a very basic 90s SUV that gave you everything you needed and just some capability, but no like bells and whistles. And I think that's interesting. And tall people do fit in this. It is a very drivable car. You just don't necessarily really want to put anybody in the back. But you can park this thing anywhere, drive it everywhere. It'd be a great little city SUV, actually. It'd be perfect in like New York City, going over all the bumps and the terrible roads in this tiny little kind of eager to zip around little thing. I think it'd be good for that. And so that's the Mitsubishi Pajero Mini. This is a really cool little vehicle, and like I mentioned, it's sort of like an earlier version of the Suzuki Jimny, the new one, which has become a global phenomenon for its tiny sizing and its boxy styling and off-road capabilities. Well, this was that just 25 years ago. These were surprisingly popular in Japan throughout the 1990s, and I'm thrilled this one has been imported to the United States, and now it's on Cars and Bids. And now it's time to give the Pajero Mini a DOUGSCORE. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, the Pajero Mini is a nice looking little mini SUV, not like gorgeous or anything, but I do appreciate the attempt to muscularify a small SUV like this, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Acceleration, of course, is a 1 out of 10. Handling is better than you might think. It's reasonably sharp and eager, probably because of its small size, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Fun factor, same deal. Despite the small engine, it's fun to drive, and it's reasonably capable off-road, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and for a 90s Mitsubishi SUV, this is pretty cool. Less so in Japan, where they sold a lot, but it would certainly turn heads at a Cars and Coffee in America, and it gets a 4 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 16 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. Not much here, just the basics, but it does have AC and a radio, and it gets a 2 out of 10. Comfort is fine, normal for a car like this, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Quality seems average in terms of materials. Reliability, who knows? These were never sold here, so there's not much data available, but the seller tells me parts are cheap and easy to find, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is decent. It's very small inside, but it's also efficient and parkable. It gets a 5 out of 10. Finally, value, and I think these are desirable at their price point, under 10 grand for a little mini SUV with 4-wheel drive. The only demerit is dealing with right-hand drive, and it gets a 6 out of 10 for a total daily score of 22 out of 50. Added up, and the DOUGSCORE is 38 out of 100, which places it here against, well, I've never reviewed a car like this before, so this is the closest stuff I could find. The Pajero Mini is cool, a tiny little basic off-roader SUV with 4-wheel drive. I've always wanted to check one out, and I'm sure the next owner will have some fun with it.